The week after the Battle of Seoul was the longest in galactic history for everyone involved. Admiral Chen spent those days coordinating relief efforts for the damaged orbital infrastructure, while simultaneously preparing his fleet for the possibility that the Valorians and Zethric would reject peace and force another confrontation. Valoria Prime emergency sessions of the High Command devolved into shouting matches between hardliners who wanted to continue the war and pragmatists who recognized that humanity had fundamentally changed. The strategic situation ambassador Thelcros stood before the assembled commanders and made his case with 4 arms spread in a gesture of brutal honesty. "Cannot defeat them," he said flatly, "not because they have more ships or better weapons, but because they fight with a desperation and creativity that we have forgotten after 10,000 years of dominance." The hardliners argued that accepting human terms would make the hegemony look weak, but Thelcros cut through their protests. "We already look weak," he countered. "We lost half our fleet attacking their homeworld and achieved nothing except proving that they can defend what's theirs while simultaneously raiding our territory in Zethric." Space, the primary consciousness, was experiencing something unprecedented, which was internal conflict. Several sub-minds had achieved enough independence to question the hive mind's strategic decisions, and they were demanding an explanation for why the collective had committed so many resources to a war that seemed unwinnable. Debate that followed was conducted through chemical signals and neural patterns, but the underlying question was simple: could the collective afford to continue fighting humanity when doing so was draining resources needed for survival and causing subminds to develop dangerous levels of independence? The primary consciousness calculated probabilities and ran simulations, and every model showed the same result, which was that prolonged war with humanity would eventually fracture the hive mind itself. On the 7th day, Chen received confirmation that both the Valorian hegemony and the Zethric collective were sending delegations to Archeos Prime. He stood in the ready room, aboard Indomitable, reviewing the treaty terms. One final time with Captain Elena Vasquez, who had been promoted to Chief Diplomatic Officer. "Do you think they'll actually sign?" she asked. Chen looked up from the documents and considered the question carefully. "They'll sign, because the alternative is worse," he said, "but whether they'll honor the treaty long-term depends on how well we enforce it." Elena nodded and pulled up the sections dealing with demilitarization and peacekeeping. "We're asking them to pull back from contested zones and allow human forces to patrol the buffer regions." She noted, "That's essentially asking them to trust us with their security." Chen smiled grimly. "No, we're telling them that we're taking control of their security because they've proven they can't be trusted with it themselves, and if they don't like it, they can try fighting us again and see how that works out." The human fleet arrived at Archeos Prime 3 days before the scheduled negotiations and immediately established a security perimeter around the station. Chen wasn't taking any chances that hardliners on either side try something stupid like assassinating the peace delegates. The station itself had been damaged during a skirmish early in the war, but humanity had paid to have it fully repaired and upgraded as a gesture that they took the peace process seriously. When the Valorian delegation arrived, Thelcros was surprised to find that human security forces had been respectful and professional in their screening procedures. He had expected the victors to be arrogant or dismissive, but instead they treated the Valorians with the courtesy due to worthy opponents. The Zethric delegation arrived 12 hours later with Speaker Vexener leading a group of subminds that had been selected for their diplomatic capabilities. Vexener's form rippled with nervous patterns as it passed through security because the collective was genuinely uncertain about how this would proceed. The negotiations took place in the Grand Chamber, where Elena had once refused to choose a side, and now she sat at the head of the table with Admiral Chen. Beside her, across from them, sat the representatives of 2 empires that had ruled the galaxy for millennia, and who now had to accept terms from a species they had dismissed as irrelevant. Chun opened the proceedings with a statement that set the tone for everything that followed. "We're here because 40,000 humans died at New Nairobi, and because millions more on both your sides have died in a war that has accomplished nothing but misery. He began this ends today." He pushed copies of the Treaty of Terra across the table to both delegations. "These are the terms, and they're non-negotiable," he continued. "You can accept them, and begin rebuilding, or you can reject them and watch us dismantle your war machines piece by piece until you have no choice. Thelkros picked up the document and began reading through the sections with growing resignation. The terms were harsh but feral. Military forces from both sides would withdraw from the contested buffer zones within 90 days. Those zones would be patrolled by human peacekeeping fleets. With full authority to engage any violations, both empires would pay reparations to colonies that had been damaged in the war, including new Nairobi war crimes tribunals would be established to investigate atrocities committed by both sides, with human judges presiding. The Galactic Council would be reformed, with humanity having permanent representation and veto power over military actions. Cultural exchange programs would be mandatory to help rebuild trust between species, and most significantly, both the Valorians and Zethric would reduce their standing military forces by 60% over the next 5 years. Speaker Vexener's 1,000 mouths spoke in unison after reviewing the terms. The collective finds these requirements acceptable. Though we question the necessity of such dramatic military reductions, Itsidalina leaned forward. The reductions are necessary because you've both proven that you can't have large militaries without using them against each other, and we're done. Watching that happen, a Valorian counselor named Kelthus spoke up with barely concealed anger. You expect us to disarm while you maintain full military capability? He challenged. How is that fair? Chen's response was cold and direct. It's fair because we won and you lost, and because we're the ones who proved we can use our military to end wars instead of starting them. The blunt truth hung in the air like a physical presence. Thelkros raised one hand to silence Kelthus before the situation could escalate. The hegemony will sign, he said quietly. We recognize that humanity has earned the right to dictate these terms. The negotiations continued for another 8 hours as lawyers and diplomats worked through the specific language of implementation. There were arguments about timelines and definitions and enforcement mechanisms, but the fundamental agreement held because both sides knew they had no real alternative. When the final document was ready, Chen produced an ancient fountain pen that had belonged to his grandfather, who had served in Earth's last major war before humanity reached the stars. This pen signed the peace treaty that ended that conflict, he explained as he affixed his signature to the document, and now it signs the treaty that ends yours. Thelkros signed next, using all 4 hands to hold the implement in a gesture that, among Aldorians, indicated a binding oath. Speaker Vexener had more difficulty with the physical act of signing, but managed to produce a mark that the collective's lawyers certified as legitimate. As the ceremony concluded, reporters from every species in the galaxy transmitted images of the historic moment across all known space. The war that had consumed 300 years and countless lives was officially over. Afterward, Thelkros approached Alina privately in one of the station's observation decks. We underestimated you, he said simply. We thought you were merchants and miners playing at civilization, and we were fools. Alina looked out at the stars and thought about all the people who had died to reach this moment. You thought we'd stay out of your war because we were weak, she replied. But we stayed out because we were building and learning and preparing. She turned to face him directly. You wanted us to choose a side, and we did choose our own. Thelkros nodded slowly. What will you do now? He asked. You have the power to rule the galaxy if you wish, Alina smiled. We don't want to rule anything, Ambassador, because ruling means getting involved in everyone's problems, and we have enough of our own. She gestured to the treaty document that was being formally registered with the new Galactic Council. We'll enforce the peace. We'll defend our interests, and we'll trade with anyone who deals honestly, she continued. But we're not interested in empire. The Valorians studied her for a long moment. The combined Valorian-Zethric armada dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system with over 2,000 capital ships and support vessels that stretched across space. The metal constellation, it was the largest military force ever assembled in galactic history, and it had one purpose, which was to destroy Earth and break humanity's will to continue the war. Admiral Chen stood on the bridge of Indomitable and watched the tactical display light up with enemy contacts that kept multiplying as the full scale of the invasion fleet became clear. They really committed everything, Commander Mills said quietly as she studied the sensor readouts. This is every available ship from both empires. Chen nodded and opened fleet-wide. Communications to every human vessel and Sol system, all ships. This is Admiral Chen, he began. What you're seeing on your screens is the enemy's attempt to do to Earth what they did to New Nairobi, and they think overwhelming force will make us surrender. He paused and let his next words carry the weight of everything humanity had fought for. They're wrong, and we're going to prove it, because this is our home, and nobody takes our home from us. The response from the fleet was immediate as thousands of voices acknowledged the order and prepared for the fight of their lives. Chun had been preparing for this moment since the war began, and every defensive measure humanity could devise was now active throughout. Sol system, the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter had been transformed into a weapons platform with railgun emplacements and missile batteries hidden in hollowed-out rocks. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn hosted defense grids that could project shield bubbles large enough to protect entire fleets. Earth's orbital infrastructure included heavy plasma cannons and point defense networks that created overlapping fields of fire. Mars had been turned into a fortress world with underground factories churning out munitions and replacement parts around the clock. Even the outer planets hosted automated weapons stations that could operate independently if the command network went down. But the crown jewel of Earth's defense was Project Sundial, which Chen had kept secret even from most of his own officers. Deep in Mercury's orbit, a network of solar collectors had been built over the past decade using mining equipment and industrial fabricators that officially didn't guessed these collectors could focus the sun's energy into coherent beams powerful enough to cut through the shields and hulls of any ship in existence. Gave the order and watched as the collectors began their alignment sequence. Enemy fleet advanced in a coordinated formation with Valorian dreadnoughts forming the vanguard and Zethric bioships spreading out to flank. They expected to overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers and firepower, because that's how conventional warfare worked. What they didn't expect was for the asteroid belt to suddenly light up with weapons fire that came from positions they hadn't detected. Thousands of kinetic rounds and missiles streaked out from concealed emplacements and caught the leading edge of the fleet in a crossfire of Valorian shields. Absorbed most of the damage, but the sheer volume of fire forced them to slow their advance and tighten their formation. As when the Zethric bioships on the flanks ran straight into the minefields that humanity had seeded throughout the outer system. The mines weren't sophisticated, but they didn't need to be, because they were just chunks of metal with basic proximity sensors and small fusion warheads. When a Zethric ship came within range, the mine would accelerate toward it and detonate on contact, creating expanding clouds of shrapnel that shredded the bioengineered. Chen watched enemy ships dying by the dozens and knew it wouldn't be enough because the fleet was too large and too determined to launch all fighters and deploy the drones swarms he ordered and bring the reserve fleet out from behind. Jupiter human pilots and advanced strike craft poured out of carriers and engaged the enemy in close quarters combat, while autonomous drones moved in coordinated patterns that confused the alien targeting systems. The battle spread across the inner system as both sides committed their forces, and space became a chaotic mass of weapons fire and exploding ships. Captain Elena Vasquez commanded the UNSC flagship Indomitables sister ship Defiant and led a squadron of heavy cruisers in a desperate holding action. Near Earth's moon, her tactical officer called out targets faster than the weapons crews could engage them, and the ship shuddered as Valorian energy beams scored hits on her shields. Return fire with all batteries, she ordered. And somebody get me a firing solution on that dreadnought. Defiant's railguns hammered the Valorian ship with tungsten slugs, while her missile tubes launched smart weapons that dodged point defense fire and detonated against the enemy's shield generators around. The rest of the squadron was fighting just as hard and dying just as fast, because the enemy had numbers and firepower that humanity couldn't match in direct combat. We need to fall back, Her Exo Lieutenant Chen Kim shouted over the sound of alarms. The shields won't hold. Alina shook her head. We hold this line because if we fall back, they get closer to Earth, and that's not happening. She knew it was a suicide mission, but someone had to buy time for the rest of the fleet to reposition. That was when Admiral Chen activated Wellington's Reversal, which was a maneuver named after an ancient Earth general who had been famous for tactical retreats that turned into ambushes. The human fleet that had been defending the inner system suddenly broke formation and began retreating toward Earth in what looked like a panicked rout. The Valorian commander saw the opportunity and ordered his forces to pursue, because catching the enemy fleet against the gravity well of their own planet would allow him to destroy them completely, the Zethric primary. Consciousness agreed and directed the bioships to close the trap from the flanks. What neither of them knew was that human capital ships had been hiding in the shadow of Jupiter and Saturn, using the gas giants' massive magnetic fields to mask their presence as the enemy fleet pushed deeper into the system, chasing what they thought was a fleeing opponent. The reserve battlegroups activated their drives and came screaming out of concealment. Batlagra Iron Hammer emerged from behind Jupiter with 40 Titan-class dreadnoughts, and twice that number in Escris's Battlegroup Stormbreak dropped out of Saturn's rings with stealth destroyers and missile frigates. Combined force hit the enemy fleet from behind and turned the pursuit into a pincer movement that caught the aliens completely by surprise. Chen watched from indomitable as the tactical situation reversed and felt a savage satisfaction that the plan was working. All ships execute close assault pattern. He broadcast, and someone activates sundial. On Mercury's surface, the solar collectors finished their alignment and began feeding concentrated stellar energy through focusing arrays. The beams that emerged were coherent light so intense that they appeared as solid bars of white fire stretching across space. First beam cut through a Valorian dreadnought from bow to stern, and the ship simply ceased to exist as its matter was converted to plasma beams, lanced out, and each one destroyed whatever it touched, because there was no defense against the raw power of a star the enemy fleet tried to scatter. But they were trapped between the reserve battle groups behind them and the reformed defense fleet in front of them. And above them, the sun's Furiolena watched from Defiant as a Zethric bioship. The size of a city was bisected by a sundial beam, and felt a moment of awe at the sheer destructive power humanity had managed to harness. All ships pressed the attack. Chen's voice came over the fleet channel, "Show them what it costs to threaten our home." The battle reached its climax as human ships closed to point blank range and began targeting enemy vessels with everything they embraced. Empowered armor, boarded crippled ships, and set demolition charges, while fighter pilots made kamikaze runs against enemy command vessels. The fighting was brutal and desperate, and neither side was asking for quarter on the Valorian flagship commander. Okros watched his fleet being systematically destroyed and realized with growing horror that humanity had been holding back during all their previous engagements. These weren't the raiders who hit supply depots and disappeared. These were warriors fighting for their home with every weapon and tactic they possessed, and they were winning in Zethric space, the primary. Consciousness absorbed damage reports from the bioships and felt something it had never experienced before, which was genuine fear. The hive mind had believed humanity could be intimidated or destroyed through superior numbers, but the reality was that humans fought harder when threatened and fought smarter when outnumbered. The battle raged for 18 hours before the enemy fleet finally broke, started with individual ships disengaging and fleeing into hyperspace, and then entire formations began to retreat. The destruction of the Zethric battle swarm sent shockwaves through galactic politics, and suddenly humanity was no longer a minor species to be ignored. Ambassador Delcros arrived at Earth orbit 3 weeks after the Battle of Sol with a diplomatic convoy and a proposal that the Valorian High Command thought would appeal to human ambition. Elena Vasquez met him in the reception hall of Unity Station and noticed immediately that his posture had changed from the casual arrogance he displayed at Archeos Prime to something more careful and measured. Captain Vasquez, he began with a slight bow that among Valorians indicated respect between near equals. The hegemony recognizes that we may have underestimated your people's capabilities. And warrior spirit. Alina gestured for him to sit and waited to hear what the Valorians were really after. We propose an alliance, Thelcros continued. Join us in the war against the Zethric, and when they are defeated, you will receive territory in the Southern Spiral Arms and full voting rights on the Galactic Council, plus trade agreements that will make Earth wealthy beyond measure. It was a generous offer by galactic standards, and Lena knew the Valorian military command must be deeply concerned about human capabilities to make it. And what would the hegemony want in return, she asked. Thelcros spread his 4 hands in a gesture of openness. simply that you commit your fleets to joint operations under Valorian strategic command. And share your weapons technology so that we can integrate it into our forces. He said together, we could end this war within a decade. Lena stood and walked to the viewport overlooking Earth below with its blue oceans and white clouds. Ambassador, the hegemony has been fighting the Zethric for 3 centuries. Sri said without turning around. If you haven't won yet with all your advantages in technology and resources, then what makes you think adding our ships will change the equation? Thelkros was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried a hint of frustration. Because you fight differently than we do, he admitted. Your tactics are unpredictable, and your weapons are crude but effective, and the Zethric don't know how to counter you yet. Alina turned back to face him. The answer is no, Ambassador, she said. Simply, we won't join your war. The Valorian delegation left. Earth space 12 hours later, and Thelkros reported back to the High Command that humanity was either supremely confident or dangerously naive. While the Valorians were making their pitch, the Zethric Collective was trying a different approach. Speaker Vexener appeared on public broadcasts across human space with a message of contrition that surprised everyone who knew how the collective operated. The assault on New Nairobi was an error in judgment by an aggressive submind that has since been reabsorbed and corrected. Vexener announced the collective offers full reparations to the families of the deceased and guarantees of human territorial integrity in exchange for a return to neutrality. The offer came with subtle threats buried in diplomatic language about how continuing hostilities would force the collective to take regrettable actions. Admiral Chen watched the broadcast from his ready room aboard Indomitable and almost laughed at how transparent it was. They're scared, he said to Commander Mills, who stood beside him. Both of them, and they're trying to either recruit us or neutralize us before we become a real threat. Mills nodded. So what do we do, sir? She asked. Chen pulled up the operational map showing human fleet positions throughout the contested zones. We show them that we're already a real threat, he said, and that we're not interested in joining anyone's empire. The orders went out within the hour, and human battle groups that had been staging in dark space began their coordinated assault on military targets belonging to both the Valorians and the Zethric battler group. Crimson Dawn hit a Valorian weapons platform in the Draken sector with a precision strike that destroyed the facility's fusion reactors and left the station drifting dead in space without killing a single crew member. The Valorians scrambled a response fleet, but by the time he arrived, the human ships had vanished into hyperspace simultaneously. Battlegroup Nighthammer destroyed a Zethric breeding complex in the Viridian Nebula using kinetic bombardment that reduced the biofactories to rubble while carefully avoiding the civilian habitation zones nearby. The pattern repeated across 50 systems as human forces demonstrated they could strike anywhere and any time with weapons that bypassed conventional defenses. They didn't occupy territory or make demands beyond the original requirement that both sides agree to peace negotiations. They simply destroyed the war infrastructure that kept the conflict running and then disappeared before reinforcements could arrive, though. Galaxy watched in amazement as this young species did something that should have been impossible and fought a two-front war against the two most powerful militaries in known space. The key to humanity's strategy was mobility and intelligence. Human ships were faster than Valorian dreadnoughts, harder to detect than Zethric bioships, and they used hit-and-run tactics that the elder races considered beneath the dignity of proper warfare. But dignity didn't matter when your supply depots were smoking craters and your fleets were chasing ghosts through hyperspace. Chen coordinated the campaign from Indomitable with a command staff that operated in rotating shifts to maintain 24-hour coverage. Intelligence reports Valorian task force moving toward New Terra. Mills reported during one briefing, they're planning to do to us what the Zethric did to New Nairobi. Chen studied the tactical display and saw the trap forming. The Valorians were sending their ships in with overwhelming force, expecting humanity to either defend the colony and be destroyed, or abandon it and lose credibility. Redirect Battlegroup Steel resolved to New Terra. He ordered and prepped the special operations teams for deployment. What the Valorians didn't know was that humanity had been developing enhanced soldiers for decades, using a combination of genetic optimization and powered armor that turned individual humans into walking weapons platforms for D8. Hours later, when the Valorian fleet arrived at New Terra, they found the colony defended by what appeared to be a token force of frigates of Valorian commander, transmitted demands for surrender, and prepared to demonstrate what happened to species that refused to know their place. That was when 20 human special forces teams teleported onto the Valorian flagship using short-range quantum displacement technology that the aliens didn't know existed. Enhanced soldiers moved through the ship like vengeful spirits. In armor that made them stronger and faster than any Valorian warrior, they didn't kill the crew unless attacked, but they did plant demolition charges on the ship's main reactor with mathematical precision. The Valorian commander found himself staring at a human soldier who stood 7 feet tall in powered armor and held a rifle that looked like it could punch through bulkheads. "You have 10 minutes to evacuate this ship," the soldier said through helmet speakers. "After that, it becomes a very expensive piece of debris." The Valorians abandoned their flagship and watched from their escort vessels as the reactor went critical and turned their pride into an expanding fireball. The human teams extracted without a single casualty and left a message for the Valorian High Command explaining that any attack on civilian colonies would be met with escalating responses. Similar operations played out across the war zone as human special forces boarded Zethric breeding ships and destroyed their biological cores or infiltrated Valorian fortress stations and sabotaged their power grids. Both elder races found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to engage in conventional battles and instead struck at the infrastructure that made their war possible. The effect on civilian populations was immediate and profound. In Valoria, prime protests erupted as citizens demanded to know why their government was fighting a species that seemed more interested in ending the war than winning it. The demonstrations grew larger when human intelligence operatives leaked documents showing how much the Valorian economy had suffered during 3 centuries of conflict and how the military leadership had been lying about progress in Zethric space. Something even more unprecedented happened when several subminds began questioning the primary consciousness about the wisdom of continuing a war that was now costing them resources without any strategic benefit. The hive mind had evolved to suppress individual thought, but the stress of fighting humanity, combined with the questions raised by the rebel subminds, created cracks in the collective's unity. Chen watched the intelligence reports with satisfaction as both empires started to fracture from within. "We're not beating them militarily," he explained to President Santos during a secure communication. "We're showing their own people that the war is pointless and expensive, and that peace is actually an option if their leaders would just accept it." Santos studied the casualty figures from human operations and noted that they were remarkably low considering the scale of the campaign. "You're fighting a limited war, Admiral," she observed, "destroying only military targets and avoiding civilian casualties, even when it would be tactically advantageous to do otherwise." Chen nodded. "We want them to surrender, not hate us forever," he said. "And we want the 72 hours after New Nairobi burned the United Nations space command went from a defensive patrol force to a full military fleet, and nobody in the galaxy had seen it coming." Admiral James Chen stood on the bridge of the UNSC flagship Indomitable and watched his tactical display light up with confirmation signals from ships that officially didn't exist. He was 58 years old with gray hair, cropped military short, and hands that never shook, even when he was ordering people into situations they might not come back from behind him. The command crew worked in efficient silence as they coordinated the largest mobilization in human history. "All battle groups reporting ready status, sir," his XO commander Sarah Mills reported from the weapons station. "Orc cloud assets are moving into position in the dark. Space reserves are beginning their burn toward the rally point." Chen nodded and pulled up the fleet manifest on his personal screen. Humanity had been building this force for 60 years in the asteroid fields beyond Neptune and in the vast empty spaces between stars where no alien patrol ever ventured. 300 capital ships ranging from the massive Titan-class dreadnoughts to the sleek Phantom-class stealth destroyers. 2,000 escort frigates and corvettes built for speed and equipped with weapons systems that had been tested in secret facilities on Mars and in the moons of Jupiter. 5,000 autonomous combat drones controlled by advanced AI that humanity had told the Galactic Council didn't possess because the elder races got nervous when young species developed. Independent machine intelligence and support vessels numbering in the tens of thousands, carrying enough munitions and supplies to wage war for years if necessary. The galaxy thought humanity was building cargo haulers and mining rigs, and technically they weren't wrong because every human ship could serve dual purpose, but what the aliens missed was that every cargo hauler had been built with military-grade engines and reinforced hulls. Send the message to Archeos Prime. Chen ordered standard diplomatic encryption. The communication went out across hyperspace channels and reached the Galactic Council within minutes. Had recorded it himself, standing in full dress uniform with the Earth's flag behind him, and his message was simple and direct. This is Admiral James Chen of the United Nations Space Command, speaking on behalf of Earth and all her colonies. He began. 3 weeks ago, the Zethric Collective murdered 40,000 human civilians in an unprovoked attack on New Nairobi, and then justified this act as a military necessity. He paused and let the weight of those words settle. The Collective assumed. We would accept this because we are young and weak and have no place in galactic power politics, he continued. They were wrong. His voice hardened into something cold and sharp. I am giving both the Valorian hegemony and the Zethric Collective 48 hours to withdraw all military forces from human space and agree to peace negotiations, he said. If you refuse, then we will show you exactly how wrong you were about humanity. The message ended, and Chen knew it would cause chaos. Archeos Prime, because young species didn't issue ultimatums to elder powers. Do you think they'll take it seriously, sir? Mills asked. Quietly, Chen pulled up the tactical plot, showing Zethric fleet movements. No, he said, which is why we're all ready. Moving the Zethric response came 18 hours later when Speaker Wexner addressed the Galactic Council and called humanity's ultimatum a pathetic bluff from a species in denial about its place in the universe. The Collective will teach these mammals the cost of arrogance, Wexner announced, and the thousand mouths smiled in unison. Zethric battle swarm numbering 300 bioships was dispatched to Sol with orders to destroy Earth's orbital infrastructure and reduce their homeworld to a pre-industrial state. The Zethric had used this tactic before on species that got too ambitious, and it always worked because overwhelming force broke the will to resist. The Swarm Commander was a submine-designated victory through inevitable consumption, and it had absorbed the memories of 40 previous successful planetary pacifications. It dropped the swarm out of hyperspace near Jupiter's orbit, expecting to find panicked human defense forces scrambling to protect their homeworld. Instead, it found Battle Group Terran Fury waiting in perfect formation with weapons hot and targeting solutions. Already locked, Chen watched from Indomitable as the Zethric swarm spread out in their standard assault pattern and felt a grim satisfaction that they were doing exactly what the simulations predicted. All ships, he broadcast on fleet-wide channels, execute Protocol Hammer. The human fleet split into 3 elements and began a coordinated attack that the Zethric had never encountered before, though. First wave consisted of stealth destroyers that fired nuclear-tipped missiles from beyond the range of Zethric biosensors and then vanished back into the dark before the enemy could acquire targeting locks. The Zethric bioships had shields designed to absorb energy weapons, but nuclear explosions were crude, kinetic, and thermal events that their defenses weren't optimized for. Sturdy bioships died in the first salvo, and the swarm mind recoiled in confusion because these weapons were supposed to be too primitive to threaten them. The second wave came in fast and hard, with frigate squadrons using gravitational slingshots around Jupiter to achieve velocities that let them punch through the Zethric formation before the bioships could. Adjust. Human pilots fired railgun slugs, accelerated 2 significant fractions of light speed, and the kinetic impact shattered bioengineered hulls. Like eggshells, the Zethric tried to coordinate a response, but that was when the third element activated, and human cyber warfare specialists unleashed programs designed specifically to exploit the hive mind's communication protocols. The swarm's unified consciousness fractured as false signals and corrupted data flooded their neural network, and suddenly 300 ships were operating on 300 different sets of order. Sectory inevitable consumption tried to reassert control, but human Electronic warfare was more sophisticated than anything the collective had faced, because humans had spent decades studying captured Zethric technology and finding its weaknesses. The battle became a massacre, and not the one the Zethric had planned. Chen watched bioships collide with each other as they received contradictory movement commands, and saw others fire on their own forces because the hive mind couldn't distinguish friend from foe through the static. Deploy the kinetic kill vehicles, he ordered. The last surprise in humanity's arsenal dropped from the bellies of the Titan class dreadnoughts and began their terminal acceleration. These were simple cylinders of tungsten and titanium with minimal guidance systems, but they were moving at 20% light speed by the time they hit at those velocities. Mass became a weapon, more devastating than any explosive, and when they connected with the bioships, the results were catastrophic. One moment, there would be a Zethric vessel the size of a city, and the next, there would be an expanding cloud of superheated plasma and debris. The entire engagement lasted 6 hours from first contact to final mop-up operations of the 300 bioships that entered. Sol System only one escaped, and that was because Chen deliberately let it go. They need to know what happened here, he told Mills, as they watched the damaged Zethric ship limp into hyperspace. They need to understand that we're not the species they thought we were. The survivor reached Zethric space 4 days later and uploaded its combat data to the collective consciousness. The analysis of the battle sent ripples of shock through the hive mind, because nothing in their projections had suggested humanity possessed this level of military capability. The Valorian hegemony received intelligence reports about the engagement within hours, and their military analysts began emergency reviews of everything they knew about human capabilities. Ambassador Thelkros watched the battle recordings and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, which was genuine concern. These weren't the cargo haulers and miners he had dismissed, and the tactics they employed showed a level of creativity and ruthlessness that contradicted every assessment the hegemony had made on Earth. Chen stood in the war room deep beneath Geneva and addressed the assembled leaders of humanity's governments. They know now that we can fight, he said. But knowing we can fight isn't the same as believing we can win, so we need to make our next move count. He pulled up a star map showing the war zone between Valorian and Zethric space. We're not going to play defense and wait for them to come at us again, he continued. We're going to take the fight to them, and we're going to show both sides that this war ends when we say it ends. President Maria Santos of the United Earth government leaned forward in her chair. What exactly are you proposing, Admiral? She asked. Chen smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. I'm proposing we do something no species in galactic history has ever attempted, he said. We're going to fight a two-front war against both the Valorian hegemony and the Zethric collective simultaneously, and we're going to win. The room fell silent as the magnitude of what he was suggesting sank in. They wanted us to choose a side, Chen said quietly, so we did, and we chose our own. The war had been raging for 300 years, and nobody could remember how it started anymore. The Valorian hegemony controlled the northern spiral arms of the galaxy, with their massive warships and energy weapons that could tear through planets like paper through fire. The Zethric collective dominated the southern regions with their endless phasals, swarms of bioengineered ships that grew like tumors in vast breeding pools and moved with the unified purpose of their hive mind. Between them lay a buffer zone of shattered worlds and debris fields where millions had died in battles that accomplished nothing but adding more ghosts to the void. The galaxy was bleeding out slowly, and everyone knew it, but pride and hatred kept the war machines grinding forward. Humanity had arrived in this mess 80 years ago when the first colony ships pushed beyond Sol and encountered a Valorian trade patrol near Proxima Centaurtha. Aliens had been dismissive at first and then mildly interested when they realized humans could mine asteroids efficiently and didn't ask too many questions about galactic politics. Over the decades that followed, humanity spread to 40 systems and built a modest network of colonies focused on agriculture and resource extraction. The elder races saw them as useful laborers and nothing more, because human ships were slow and their weapons primitive and their populations tiny. Compared to the trillions that made up the great powers, neither the Valorians nor the Zethric considered humanity worth recruiting as allies, and both had made it clear that the war was beyond human understanding or concern. Captain Alina Vasquez stood in the observation deck of Archeos Prime and watched the security shuttles patrol the neutral station's perimeter with their weapons hot and ready. She was 42 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun, and eyes that had seen enough of space to know when trouble was coming. Summons from the Galactic Council had been polite but firm, and she knew what they wanted before she even docked through the transpersteel windows. She could see the assembled fleet representatives from both sides, glaring at each other across the docking rings like dogs waiting for the leash to break. Ambassador Thelkros of the Valorian hegemony was 7 feet tall, with golden skin that shimmered under the station lights, and forearms that ended in clawed hands built for combat. He sat on one side of the council chamber with perfect posture and radiated the kind of confidence that came from knowing your species had ruled the stars for 10,000 years across. From him sat Speaker Vexener, representing the Zethric collective, and its form shifted constantly as the hive mind adjusted the biological avatar to better process the environment. It looked vaguely humanoid, but with too many joints and skin that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that spelled out chemical messages only other Zethric could read. Between them sat representatives from a dozen minor species, who had chosen sides in the war and now regretted it but were too invested to back out. Lena took her seat at the human delegation spot and felt every eye in the room turned toward her with expressions ranging from contempt to mild curiosity. Thelkros spoke first, and his voice was deep and resonant like thunder rolling across mountains. The Valorian hegemony has called this session to demand that humanity choose a side in the great conflict. He announced without preamble, "You have profited from both our markets and refused to commit to the righteous cause against the Zethric plague." The insult was casual and automatic as breathing Speaker Vexener's form rippled and 1,000 small mouths opened across its chest to create a chorus of voices speaking in perfect unison. The collective agrees that neutrality is no longer acceptable in these times. It said humanity must recognize that the Valorian oppressors threaten all free species and join us in liberation or face the consequences of collaboration. Alina waited until the chamber fell silent, and then stood slowly to let them see she wasn't intimidated. "Earth's position hasn't changed," she said, simply, "we have trade agreements with both your governments and defense pacts with neither, because we came to the stars to build new homes for our people and not to die in conflicts that started before we left our homeworld." Thelkros leaned forward, and all 4 of his hands pressed against the table in a gesture that among Valorians indicated barely contained aggression. "You speak of neutrality as if it is a virtue, but we see it as cowardice," he said. "Your species hides behind commerce, while civilizations burn, and you lack the courage to stand for anything beyond profit." Several delegates murmured agreement, and Alina felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her like gravity on a high G world. She had expected this and kept her voice level. When she responded, "We don't hide behind anything, Ambassador," she said. "We simply recognize that this war has consumed enough lives and treasure without adding ours to the pile, and that neither side seems interested in actual victory, just in making sure the other side bleeds as much as they do." The chamber erupted in outrage, and voices from a dozen species overlapped in accusations of insolence and ignorance. Speaker Vexener rose from its seat, and the bioluminescent patterns on its skin flared bright red in a threat display. "You know nothing of what is at stake here, human," it said, and the 1,000 mouths spoke with such venom that Alina felt the hairs on her neck rise. "The collective fights for the freedom of all species to evolve beyond the tyranny of individualism, while the Valorians would see us enslaved to their outdated notions of honor and hierarchy." Thelkros slammed one fist on the table hard enough to crack the surface, and his eyes blazed with golden fire. "The Zethric seek to destroy everything that makes a species unique and absorb all consciousness into their obscene collective." He roared, "We fight to preserve the right of individuals to choose their own destiny." Lena sat down and let them rage because she knew nothing she said would change their minds. The session dragged on for 6 more hours, with both sides making demands and threats, while the minor species representatives tried to broker compromises that nobody would accept. When it finally ended, Thelkros approached Alina in the corridor outside the chamber with 2 of his honor guard flanking him. "You should reconsider your position, Captain," he he said, and his voice was quieter now, almost gentle. The hegemony has been patient with humanity. Because we see potential in your species, but patience has limits, and the galaxy will not wait forever for you to grow up. Alina met his gaze without flinching. We appreciate the hegemony's patience. Ambassador, she said, but Earth's answer remains? No, he studied her for a long moment, and then nodded slowly as if confirming something he had suspected. Then you will learn the hard way that neutrality is just another word for weakness, he said before turning and walking away 3 weeks later. The Zethric Collective launched a massive assault on New Nairobi. Colony World sat in a contested region of space that both powers claimed, but neither fully controlled, in humanity. Had settled it 5 years earlier with a population of 40,000 farmers and miners. The Zethric battle. Swarm dropped out of hyperspace without warning and began bombardment from orbit before the colony's defense satellites could even charge their weapons. BO ships. And acid and kinetic projectiles down on the settlements below, and within 4 hours. New Nairobi was a smoking wasteland. 40,000 people died in their homes and fields, and the few who managed to reach emergency shelters suffocated when the Zethric deliberately targeted the air recycling systems. Lena watched the recordings of the attack from Earth and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. The Zethric commander who led the assault sent a message to the Galactic Council, explaining that New Nairobi had been in a militarily strategic location, and humanity should have evacuated when given the opportunity. This is the price of neutrality, the message concluded. The collective regrets the necessity, but war demands. Difficult choices. The galaxy waited to see what humanity would do. And the consensus among the elder races was that Earth would either join the Valorians for protection or retreat. Further into their own territory, they had seen young species break. Before, under the weight of galactic reality, what they didn't know was that humanity had spent 80 years in the galactic community, not trading and mining, but watching and learning and building. And what they definitely didn't know was that 40,000 dead humans was a number that would haunt every member of their species until someone paid the price. The galaxy thought humanity would accept this because accepting reality was what weak species did. They were about to learn that humans had a very different definition of reality.